Come on up, guys.
Thank you very much, Rosie, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us here for what promises to be a really, really interesting discussion. My name's Simon Mundy. I'm the editor of the FT's Moral Money platform. And we're going to be discussing something which I've been particularly interested in for over a decade. I started my career in South Africa, actually. And I arrived there in 2009, at a time when there was a lot of controversy around a new book that had just come out, which I'm sure others in the audience may have read. It's called Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo, the Zambian economist. And she made the argument that various forms of what could be thought of as philanthropy, but certainly aid, could be counterproductive. She actually argued for the removal of aid in some cases. She argued that this could actually be corrosive to the development of certain countries' development. And this was quite an eye-opener for me because it had never really occurred to me quite in this way to consider how complicated philanthropy giving is. We often hear people talk about giving money to charity. The money will go to charity as though it's just this single amorphous thing. It doesn't really matter what happens to it, but it matters a lot. Philanthropy, I think overall we'd all agree it's more good than bad, but it's not easy to get right. And it's very important to get it right at a time when there are such extraordinary challenges of all stripes all around the world. To introduce the panel who'll be discussing how to get it right, to my right is Lily Lewis. She's the founder of the Pocracy Initiative, which is a grant-giving organization. To her right is Grant Gordon, who's a social entrepreneur and philanthropist. And to his right is Derek Bardowell, who's the CEO of 10 Years' Time and author of the book Giving Back. Lily, to start with this point that I alluded to, is it a danger to really get philanthropy badly wrong?
How long have you got? Is my mic on? Yeah. Yeah, I think massively. I think, just so many examples come to mind. I think there's an extreme amount of harm that comes from philanthropy within the charity sector. And I think there's also assumptions that because people have good intentions, that there won't be harm, but there is. I think there's an extreme amount. I think there's a lack of acknowledgement and reflection on how our philanthropic system was built, especially if we're thinking about the UK and its ties to colonialism and whiteness and white supremacy. And I think a lot of communities are still getting left out of the conversation and are not getting funded because of the rooted inequality in the way that the charity sector and philanthropic sector was set up.
So Grant, would you agree with that? And how do you try, as someone active in the philanthropy space, to dodge those pitfalls?
Yeah. So everybody hear me? Yeah. Is this on? Is this on? 1 second.
Just press it once.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everybody. Delighted to be here. So I think, sort of building on Lily's point, I think one of the issues in terms of philanthropy, particularly maybe philanthropy for wealthy people, is a sense of maybe not understanding fully what the impact is of their giving. And sometimes, if you take that to the extreme, sense of disillusion that can come to bear, or dissatisfaction around giving. And I think part of that is maybe down to the cultural issues around philanthropy. Are we thoughtful enough as a nation about our giving? Do we treat it in a way that, do we give it enough deep thought, research, Do we try and understand, the issues before we get into the act of giving? So I think there's a good debate to be had around that question. So making giving more, giving it more satisfaction to the donor, but always mindful that ultimately the giving is for the beneficiary. So putting yourself into the shoes and the mind of the beneficiary, and we'll talk more about community engagement, I think, when we move on in the conversation, Simon.
Thanks a lot, Grant. Derek, coming to you, what are the key things you advise high net worth people on how to focus their giving? What are the key principles that you urge them to follow?
Well, I think first and foremost, I agree with Lily in terms of the framing of this, and so much of this is that question around, is philanthropy inherently good? Well, probably in terms of its original meaning, love of humanity, yes, absolutely. In terms of what it's become in terms of its institutional practices, it becomes slightly more problematic because we know that a lot of philanthropy is there to maintain the social order. It's there for very wealthy people to enter different markets. We understand that the way the decisions are made and who gets to make some of those decisions is really problematic. We also know that it's there in a lot of cases to maintain the social order. So you have to ask that question around, to what degree is it philanthropy and giving? To what degree is it offsetting? And when I say offsetting investment practices that might be more extractive and actually doing more harm than your philanthropy is doing good. So for us at 10 years' time, the work that we do as advisors is very much around gearing people to really interrogate their wealth, to really not look at philanthropy as the 1% or the 2% that they give away, but really to look at their wealth in a more holistic way, and to really look at everything from how that wealth was accumulated, how their money is invested, and to really look at things above and beyond just the 2 or 5% that they might be given away. And I think that's really, really crucial and key because, to Grant's point, if the idea is you're giving money away because it satisfies yourself, or you're giving money away because, I don't know, you want to mend your relationship with your children or your relatives as a result of that, then actually where you start talking about harm, you are talking in the long term that while there might be short-term gains, there might be longer-term harms. And when we look at philanthropy now in terms of the longer-term harms, as I said, who gets the money or the percentage of money that goes to, for example, racially minoritized groups or other minoritized groups, the fact that so much money goes towards services, which I'm not knocking, but very little goes towards systemic change. There's not money that really helps communities to self-determine and self-govern. When you look at the lack of money that goes towards some of those key areas that tackles the root causes of these issues, then you're talking about these disparities really being replicated from society into philanthropy.
I think there's another point that you both raised around donor satisfaction, and I think especially with it for philanthropists and family philanthropy, there is almost this obsession with it being a bonding activity for family members to bring family together. And I think that just really needs to be challenged. I think that's also where just so much harm, as you've both spoken to, can happen when the focus is on the donor, expecting for this to be something that brings them enjoyment almost. And I think a lot of the work that needs to be done is funding things that may seem boring and unsexy, but that's the stuff that needs to be funded because no one else is touching it.
So Lily, I agree with that. Now, I think another sort of lens through which we could think about philanthropy is looking at it in terms of need. So, we live in an unequal society here. I think one of your colleagues at the FT described this country last year and the United States as a poor country with big pockets of wealth. So we live in this unequal country. We've got these issues, these social issues. And one way of thinking about the social issues is obviously the SDGs. The first 5 SDGs, they're basically all around issues around poverty, they're around issues around health, issues around education, well-being, and also engagement of women. That's number 5. So I think, if we start to ask ourselves questions when we start to look at our giving and centered around what those needs are, engaging, as Derek's talking about, engaging in the communities and getting them involved in that conversations too. I think that's a way to take it out of the setting of the family and their values. Not losing that, but really turning it around and saying, okay, so in society, what is the role that philanthropy can play, recognizing that it is a very, very limited resource. It's 0.5% of the UK's GDP. There's 11 billion of individual giving in the UK. Government expenditure is like, almost 100 times that. So that is, that's the sort of, the size of the resource we've got is very limited.
But I just want to take it a step further. It's not just about need, it's about solutions. And in communities, if you have gone through systemic issues, then people in communities understand what the problems are a lot better than the academics that are being paid to do it. So being paid to define the whatever trust-based philanthropy or whatever the latest trend is in philanthropy. I don't know if anyone here was watching the World Cup, and during the World Cup, what went viral was the Pele. Before he passed away, Pele, there was this video about Pele did it first. So I don't know if anyone saw that particular video, but there's lots of grainy images of Pele doing things that we see Lionel Messi and Diego Maradona and Zinedine Zidane doing. I'm not going to do a football lecture, but my point here is that so many things that we call good practice in philanthropy has been done and practiced in indigenous and low socioeconomic communities historically for years and years and years. They might not have been in a position to have defined it or called it fancy or call it something fancy or have an article in the Harvard Business Review or whatever. But in terms of doing it first, a lot of the solutions are there. And that's the gift of philanthropy, if it's done really well, is really being able to spot what is happening in communities around solutions and some of the principles around that, things like solidarity, sacrifice, trust, and all of those wonderful things are the things that philanthropy needs to learn from in order to do it really well.
Yeah, really watching what happens in the community, understanding the community, having proper links with the community is essential. There's a famous story of something called the play pump. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with this. This was a brilliant idea that someone had. He saw that people, largely women in a lot of villages in Africa, had to spend a lot of time pumping water by hand. And the idea was children love to play. So if you build a sort of children's merry-go-round type thing, and connect that to a water pump, then the children would pump water while they play. The trouble was that not enough understanding existed between the person who developed this idea and the communities in question. And so the play pump was rolled out in various villages in Africa, and the children played with it for about half an hour, and then they got bored of it, and what ended up happening was that the women of the village had to spend enormous amounts of time and effort, much more than previously, and in a very degrading way, pushing around this roundabout type thing instead of using a much more efficient hand pump. And the trouble is that it took a long time for the problems with this idea to come to light. It's an example of what can happen when that lack of community engagement is a problem. Lily, do you think this is a really widespread problem in the philanthropy space when people are, perhaps with fantastic intentions, are proposing, putting in place ideas and solutions in communities where it might not be appropriate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's happening everywhere. Just because I have access to wealth or I'm in the position as a funder, why does that mean that automatically I should have the power on deciding how the money is spent? And I think automatically we make that assumption that just because the person has that money that they are the best person to decide. And I think the example that you just gave, I think it was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where the water pump, also the metal of it got too hot, and so it overheated and people couldn't even touch it anymore. And I see examples like this happening everywhere in the UK. It doesn't matter where it is, and I've definitely been prone to that myself as well. But I think just really going to the root of the issue and thinking, why should I be the person deciding how and where this money is spent? It doesn't make sense. And I think, as to kind of what Derek was speaking to, it makes so much more sense if someone is in the position to have access to wealth or power in that way, to bring together people in the community that you're seeking to support, and they be the ones to make the decisions of how the money gets spent. I really think it is that simple, and it really is that effective. But I think there's an issue that most people in positions as funders don't want to talk about, and that is that we like power and we like control. And I think if we were to really redesign the structure of giving in the way that it needs to be kind of hashed out, a lot of people wouldn't have jobs anymore. But I think that's the nature of really what needs to happen to address inequality, as kind of Grant was talking to.
Yeah, Grant, I know you've thought a lot about this. I mean, what is the best way for philanthropists to really make sure that what they're getting up to is really in tune with what's needed on the ground?
Yeah, so Simon, I think just as I reflect on it, I think about, and I'll try and use a practical example in this context. I think there is this notion of, philanthropy being done to people, and we know that Lily's reflecting on that and saying, that's not the way. But there's also people, those in society, those particularly marginal people, maybe some of the most marginal in society, and the trust they have of government and the agencies of government, where there are issues as well. So I think we've been working in the context of early years in Stoke-on-Trent with Thrive at 5, and with a backbone organisation that's bringing together lots of stakeholders to look at how you can support better outcomes for early years. How you can get kids ready for school. Simple thing. It sounds simple, but it's hard to achieve. And really, the point here is that the engagement with the community, talking to the community, getting people in the community to put their hand up and say, I would like to help champion this issue. I'm interested in this issue. I think it's important, not just for me and my family, but I can see for my neighbors, others in the community. And people standing up, engaging in the issue, giving them some tools that they can help, and the trust that in the village, if you like, the metaphorical village, the trust there between when local people are there in front of these issues and they can talk to each other about these issues. It can be decisions around funding, but it can also be simple things like, why don't you go and talk to this organization over here? Did you know that this existed? So it was maybe just it was Paul Collier. You'll know Paul Collier, who said that at the Beacon conference, Derek and I met there. He got up and said that he thought that levelling up was a great idea, investment and so on. He said, but without community engagement, it will not be a success. So yes, all for that, and empowering the communities to be the change.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we're in the UK. There's a certain we can see all around us the opportunity to have an impact, problems that need fixing. There are others who would argue, look, the UK is a relatively prosperous country. We should focus on fixing problems in the poorest countries. Derek, what do you think is the right balance to that question?
Well, we're interdependent, so we can't forget the fact that the global north plunders something like $2 trillion per year from the global south. So in terms of what this should look like, in my mind, this should look like reparations. It should look like a more reparative way of doing things. And I always come back to philanthropy, given its high level of independence, and I say that we do have a regulatory body in the Charity Commission, but there is a high level of independence in terms of how you can give your money away. It is actually a really good place to start, investigating where your money goes, but also starting to look at ways in which how you can give that money back. I know that there has been governments, municipalities, and other places that have already done this, from New Zealand to various places in the States, in terms of taking a reparative approach to things, which is a stepping stone towards reparations. But I also think that philanthropy has a really good place to really interrogate that wealth and start that motion towards giving back. And I say this because if you look, and again, it's one of the things I say very often, but if you look at the way that the right-wing philanthropists stroke lobbyists in America spent a lot of their money, they spent millions and billions of pounds in, tax breaks, funding think tanks and others and lobbyists around deregulation and minimizing social services and workers' rights and other things. It's that thing for me that says, how can philanthropy at its very best become a bit more focused in the way that it funds things like, as I said, reparations, decolonization of our systems, abolitionist movements and other things. I'm not saying that a lot of wealthy people want to fund any of those things. What I am saying is that the way that philanthropy is working at the moment, knowing that it's not enough money to have as much impact to, say, the government, it has to be catalytic. It can't be just replicating what the government or the private sector does, because we'll just be sitting here in 20 years' time and saying, oh, okay, we've put £1 trillion into this and there's been no impact as a result. So something drastically different and philosophically has to happen in the way that this money is catalyzed. That's why I advocate for. I'm not saying that we are ready and there, that funders and philanthropists right now are there for that to happen. I hope that the next gen, who are thinking slightly differently about wealth, will start to take up the mantle. But one of the things that we know we cannot do is just do the same thing. And if you look at philanthropy as an institutional practice in the last God knows how many years, it hasn't drastically changed. The system has been very much the same for a long, long period of time.
Grant, you want to add something on that?
Well, I was just wanting to maybe try and reflect on, Derek, your comment about, philanthropy and where it can play a role, a useful role, alongside recognizing the issues you're raising. And I'm thinking UK. I'm thinking about the UK. We've talked about the limited resource of philanthropy, but where it's different, I think it stands out in two ways. One is it's a form of risk capital. It can afford to make some big bets on change in whatever the issue is. In our case, say early childhood, but also it can think longer term. It's got that longer term horizon, and this is what makes it fundamentally different, I think, from other actors like the business sector, but primarily the government, and how it is different in government. So I think, bottling that, capturing that is, if we do that well, then, that limited resource, I think, with all those issues that we're talking about, it's something that it's a role that philanthropy is filling in the market, if you like, for social change, for a better society.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, this question about how philanthropic organizations can act as catalysts, galvanizing agents. There's been a lot of talk about the shortcomings of the World Bank. I'm not sure if anyone saw the panel discussion where David Malpass, who's the head of the World Bank, was asked if he was a climate denier, as Al Gore had accused him of being, and he just sort of said, oh, well, I'm not a scientist. And it was all a bit of a scandal because the World Bank is under scrutiny for not delivering the sort of work that's needed in blended finance. And that basically means organizations like the World Bank taking that riskiest tranche of capital structure to sort of crowd in private finance to make these sorts of investments in developing countries more attractive for profit-seeking financial institutions. And what's interesting is that this is not just the preserve of multilateral development banks. Charities, foundations can also play this sort of role by making these sorts of risky investments precisely because they're not bound to seek profits. I wonder if the panel think that this is something that we need to see more of, which is charities working more and more closely with the private sector, with financial companies, or could there be risks there? Could charities end up getting pulled down the wrong path?
There you go.
It's a nasty one.
No, I was just going to say that, I mean, it depends how mission aligned, you know, that private sector organization is. You know, if it's, I don't know, a fossil fuel company, you know, you're not necessarily going to be a social enterprise, social entrepreneur working with one of the fossil fuel companies. If, for example, the organization has really bad or poor employment practices, it has to be mission aligned. But even that aside, and again, taking Grant's point, you know, philanthropic organizations, funders, charitable trust foundations can take really significant big bets. And they could fund work for a substantial amount of years and support through multiple election cycles to help either an intervention or a particular specific piece of work or a community. So if you're investing in community wealth building and enabling communities to determine their own destinies and self-govern, you can fund that over a long period of time. I think there are opportunities that lie not just in, you know, the next gen of funders coming into the space, but if charitable trusts and foundations are releasing more of their endowments towards this, it lies in the fact that you know, and I think to Grant's point, you know, if we were more generous in this country, you know, and I think giving is, major individual giving's going down while the wealth disparities is continuing. There's a lot of money that can catalyze change. And I think the opportunity is, for me, really crucial because you have amazing people like, I don't know, Amara Spence at the Yard Art House in Birmingham, Civic Square and what they're doing in Birmingham, Rekindle in Manchester. There is amazing organizations, Ubele, who are absolutely game-changing organizations that, given the level of resource, trust, and long-term support, could be creating some of the alternative systems that, let's face it, in a few years' time, we're going to have to rely on something very different than the world that we're living in at this particular time in terms of an unfit-for-purpose education system, a health system that is fracturing, our local services that are fracturing. What, are we going to sell everything off to the private sector? Or can the philanthropic sector be catalysts in creating an alternative and building an alternative that is more regenerative, that is more loving, that is more considerate to communities, and provides a really good alternative to what might be in 20 or 30 years' time?
To play devil's advocate, some people might hear that and say, well, we need to be doubling down on the state sector. And it reminds me a bit of a book by Anand Giridharadas, who talks about what he sees as the risk that the wealthy elite of society like to focus on philanthropy because they don't like the idea of the state taking their money in the form of taxes and spending it in the form of state spending. But I don't think your point is that we shouldn't be doubling down on state provision of services. But how can these two things really work together?
No, what I'm really emphasizing is that there are some amazing people that are creating alternatives to the status quo that are woefully underfunded at this particular point. And if we are in a situation where some of the core state services are fracturing, or there's not an alternative, or the government wants to sell it off to the private sector, then what role can philanthropy play in funding and supporting the alternatives that can be more regenerative and not just a market-driven or a market-based response?
And I think as well, a lot of these organizations, a lot of these change makers on the ground, they don't really want to be associated with the charity sector anymore. And a lot of these organizations prefer to develop as community interest companies because they don't want that power dynamic with funders. I think because of the really challenging way that the funding system, the application processes to get grants has been set up. And I think there's a massive racialized element within that as well, the power of whiteness within philanthropy, and the majority of people holding the money and people as grant managers within philanthropy are also white. And there are massive, I think, a lot unconscious, but conscious as well, power dynamics within that aren't being addressed. And It's difficult with the charity commissioner as well, because you can't fund an organisation who isn't registered as a charity or a CIC. But a lot of these people doing this work, they're not registered as these things. So you need to be incredibly flexible with the money that you're giving and be giving it out really, really quickly. And the majority of foundations aren't doing that.
So what would your suggestion be to people who are in the audience or watching online? I imagine some of whom are in a position where they're dispersing funds. How can they do it better?
So something that we've been able to do at the Procresti Initiative is put together a group of activists and people with lived experience and expertise who are working within these communities, and they're deciding how the money is getting spent, what the strategies are, and they're obviously paid for their time. Because I think also this is another thing within the sector, people aren't paid for their time. It's just not happening. I think there's this culture of, you know, people think that they should be martyrs, and just because you work within this sector, you shouldn't be paid for your time. And so lots of people are having to do labour and emotional labour, especially if they have lived experiences of these issues. These people are being asked to do emotional labour and consultancy for free. And so getting people with expertise and lived experience and paying them well for their time to come in, and they can decide where the money is going, rather than a group of funders and grant managers sitting in a room and kind of consulting but kind of choosing when they want to and don't want to kind of engage. I think we need to cut out that middleman. Essentially, people like me and shouldn't be here. Like, there's no reason for me to exist within this sector, within this work. So it's kind of cutting myself out of a job and making sure it's people within communities who are deciding really quickly how the grants are getting spent and where they're going to.
Grant, do you think that's a fair assessment? Is that the sort of thing that Lily was describing there? How widespread do you think that is in this sector?
I do agree with Lily on that, and I think I always advocate to obviously engage with the community, engage with beneficiaries, understand the need, but at the same time, peers, engage with your peers too. Could I come back to an earlier point maybe, and I just like to wheel back to the question about, we've talked about government, its interest, we've talked about philanthropy, but we've had this question of business hanging in the air. What could be the interest of business really around the sort of issues that we grapple with? And I'm thinking particularly children and young people. Well, I think there's a real alignment of interest, because ultimately this is an issue of human capital. This is an issue of what nations have in terms of a next generation, a generation that's growing up, and the knowledge that that nation is going to have in the future. So I think that is where there's a really important touch point with business. And I'll give you, or business and organizations in civil society. One of the examples there comes from North America, is that the United States Army got very interested in the issue of early years, or early childhood, as they would refer to it there. And the reason they were looking at this issue is they're understanding how difficult it is. They're challenged in finding the talent that they need, for the men for the future, armed forces of the United States. So I think there's a real question, good question to ask around how do we work more with business in terms of aligning our interests as philanthropists with their interests.
Yeah, it's a really important one. Derek, do you see much more scope for that sort of deep partnership?
I was just going to loop back to your original question, because I just really wanted to say, look, as a first step, who the hell works for you? Who decides? Who's on your governance board? Just start with that. If that is not in any way, shape or form reflective of the communities that you are serving, then you have your answer right there. So that, for me, just in terms of, because sometimes we have these conversations, and we have the conversations, everyone's like, nods their head, agrees, walks away, and just does the same thing over and over again. I've done it multiple times, right? Just check who the hell is on your governance board and who the hell is in your organization. And if you're doing something on, I don't know, child poverty or serious youth violence or something like that, and there is no one in there that has delivered a program, has lived expertise of the issue, has not been a former practitioner in some way, shape or form, or something of that nature, then you have your answer right there and then. because all that you end up doing is that somewhere along the line, you end up having to keep retrofitting bad practices. So just start off right from the root in terms of needs, solutions, and people that are most impacted having that influence straight away. And for me, as a first step, that is absolutely fine.
And how serious a problem is that question of representation at the senior level?
It's so problematic because we saw straight after George Floyd was lynched in May 2020 that everyone was having to completely retrofit everything that they were doing in their systems because one, they didn't really give a damn, if I'm being really honest, in terms of racial injustice. They'd underfunded and underserved a number of organizations historically for a number of years. And then when they were put into a position where, to be honest, they had to news manage a lot of those issues because they knew that if they weren't keeping up, that it might be problematic in terms of their comms, they were not sure what to do. And now we come back to 2.5 years later, and a number of those organizations that were making pledges and saying things are now treating racial justice not as a centralized issue, but as a minoritized issue. They're now turning around and saying, okay, that trend's kind of gone now. We're going on to the cost of living crisis. And I'm like, the cost of living crisis, organizations like the Runnymede Trust were producing reports like 7-8 years ago about the cost of living crisis for women of color in this country. But now, so my point here is that most of the people and the funders, because of often who's in the organization and who's governing it, at the very first base level, I'm not saying that's the only thing, I'm just saying at a base level, the right people are not in place. It means that everything is very reactionary, but it also means that everyone ends up refitting and retrofitting all of their solutions and interventions because they've not considered it in the outset.
So there's an issue with trends and fads, perhaps, to some extent in this sector, as in many others. I mean, there's an argument which I was, when I first saw it, I was quite taken aback. There's an argument against excessive giving to disaster relief, because according to this argument, one of the issues is that a terrible disaster happens somewhere and there's an enormous rush of funds to that response, but actually the impact that can be had with each dollar that goes to that disaster relief is potentially less than the investment that can go into fixing some of these systemic issues that we've been talking about. And it's a very difficult argument to make, isn't it? Because no one would want to argue for less money going to, in itself, less money going to fix the impact of a natural disaster. But it reflects, I think, what you're talking about there, this very reactive approach to things that happen in the news in philanthropy.
I think elephant in the room, I think you got to, there's the disasters, and we all react to the disasters and look at the deck appeal for Ukraine, the biggest response, I think, ever. But when it's not a disaster, the other area that you might question or ask, why do people do it, is animal welfare. It's animal welfare has more donations by number, not by quantum. It's 11% of total giving in the UK, so 9%, sorry. It's a very high number, but it's the highest number of donations. So it's this thing about, I suppose it's that balance between, your emotion, your values on the one hand, and perhaps, being thoughtful about need on the other.
So what role should emotion play? Because we are humans, we're not robots. Emotion is always going to play some role. And yet there is an argument, isn't there, for saying, try to take a step back, try to take a dispassionate look at where your money can have the most impact. I mean, Lily, what do you think is right? I mean, I presume, for example, you're doing your work because you care about it. At least you seem to care about it. You haven't just taken a dispassionate look and crunched some numbers and thought, okay, I'll do that. So what's the right approach to this, to the question of emotional connection when it comes to the world of philanthropy versus cold-eyed logic?
I mean, I like animals. I'm obsessed with animals. But for me, I was taught 80-20, 80% head, 20% heart, when I did a training with Grant at the Philanthropy workshop many years ago that we did together, coincidentally. Yeah, 80% head, 20% heart. And I guess that could mean lots of different things. But I think going back to what I mentioned before, a lot of the funding needed by the organizations that I'm partnering with, it's not something that may feel very exciting for me. I think there's a massive culture around poverty porn where funders want to show up at an organization once or twice a year and they want to see something that they feel connected to and meet someone who's accessed the service and tell them about their life. And I think it's incredibly harmful and complicated, but they want to feel that they've had impact. And a lot of where the money needs to go, I'm not necessarily going to see the impact of that ever. And that's okay. Like, I don't need to feel a personal connection to that. What gives me the right to kind of feel that I should? I think there's a relationship with power and control there if I'm kind of leaning on that emotional connection. But yeah, I think it's a complex one.
Yeah, I mean, Derek touched earlier on this question of motivation, and also this idea of offsetting. I suppose, perhaps an extreme example of that is the Sackler family, who ran Purdue Pharma, this opioid company, made enormous amounts of money from selling these drugs, which did horrific amounts of damage. They were knowingly under-declaring the dangers. People got addicted to opioids, and many of them suffered serious health problems or even died. But with a large chunk of the money that came from selling these opioids, the Sacklers did philanthropy, and they did specifically giving to art galleries that would put their names on them. So there's I think still, has it been taken off now in the National Gallery? I think last thing I saw, there was a Sackler wing or a Sackler room, and galleries all over the world. And I suppose that highlights two of the things that we've been mentioning. One is this idea of offsetting, that it's okay if we do bad on one side as long as we do good on the other side, and it sort of nets out. But the second one is this question of motivation, because they wanted to see an impact, certainly in the form of having their names on a building, and this is quite a common thing. The Gates Foundation has Bill and Melinda's name on it. Is that a bad thing? Do we think this is a harmless thing if rich people get to have an ego boost at the same time as achieving a positive impact? Derek, do you have thoughts on that? Because you work with people who are giving serious amounts of money.
So the heart is important, and people's personal values is important, and we don't try to divorce from that, but we try to really unpick and understand what the real motivation is. And often some of the people that we might have worked with might feel, yep, this is how they feel because they've seen something on television, so it's an entry point, but then very quickly want to start giving money away quickly because they feel that they've got the answer. And so we're very much like, okay, hold on a minute, let's just really unpick this, and this takes a bit of time. And I think a lot of this stems from the fact that you kind of need to do a couple of things simultaneously. One is do the work. So do the real deep work to really understand what is underlining your approach to giving and what that is, interrogate your wealth and all of that deep work. But also really understanding that if you are going to do this, you have a responsibility to also get money out of the door, because we can't wait. Our planet is being destroyed. People are being destroyed as we speak. So there has to be a level of urgency, but with that urgency, a level of reflection. So there's no reason why people can't have a dual strategy in the way that they are tackling these particular issues. And, to that point, look, if you're talking about real legacy is not going to be in the buildings, right? Or people's names on buildings. And I think it's often the case where people talk on the level of, in 20, 30 years, I'm going to have this name on the building forever and ever and ever. And anyone that read Empire of Pain about the Sackler family, which is one of the great books on philanthropy, even though it was more about the pharmaceutical industry, it tells you that at some point, people's legacies are really going to be unpicked. And if people understand that the level of damage that family did completely outdid the self-serving nature of their philanthropy, then it will get torn down. And who's going to have to deal with it? Their kids or their grandkids. So I think that notion of let's look 50 years down the line and look at the fact that we've had the biggest public health crisis in the UK since World War II, and look at how much giving has actually happened in that time, because we know lots of charitable trusts and foundations are still only giving away whatever between 1% and 4% of their wealth and have gained money over that period of time. You can't tell me that when we look back in 30, 40, 50 years' time, that the legacy of what people didn't do with their wealth is not going to be a damning legacy. So for me, I look at it this way. If we're looking into the future of philanthropy, we cannot be having this conversation in 2 years' time, but we can't be having this conversation in 20 years' time where we're still trying to get a foundation to give 1% more of their £750 million that they owe, or people give 7% of their wealth, or whatever it might be. If we're in a position of urgency, what are you waiting for? Because that plaque is not going to be there. That plaque will be ripped down. That plaque will be taken down in years to come.
They have already, as you mentioned, I mean, they have already started being pulled down for the sacklers, haven't they? Yeah, so it's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, the question of whether it matters that egos are a part of this. I mean, Grant, do you have thoughts? You must have come across a lot of egos in this space over the years.
Well, I've been part of a movement called the Beacon Collaborative. We talked about that before. I think chairs in the room here, Matthew Bocock. And I think when we talk about the culture of giving, I think there's a few things. One is, I think it's maybe not the recognition, it's just to celebrate philanthropy. It's the good of philanthropy. I think that's one thing. I think peer pressure is another thing that is also something that can help too. I think talking, person to person, and through the examples that certain people give. And another piece is obviously the professional community. We all work with those of wealth. We work with advisors. So what do they know about philanthropy? What do they talk about philanthropy? But I just want to come back to one more thing that you said, and this is my own personal opinion. I think if you're in that position, you're looking at your giving, I think being surrounded, whether it be your trustees or a group of advisors, by people who've got that knowledge, maybe the experience of the issue, they've lived the issue, or they're people who are professionals in the sector who worked in the issues. Your governance, if you like, your governance is quite an important thing. And sometimes it's your trustee, who'll say something to you, talk to you, and then, your mind opens up and you think, okay, there's a different way of doing it. So, a few thoughts.
Thanks a lot. I've been hogging the questions so far, but I'd really like to bring in the rest of the room. If you have any questions for our panelists, or indeed if you'd just like to give your thoughts on anything you've heard, please don't be shy. Yes, please.
Hi, thanks. This is so interesting. I'm just curious to know, maybe for Derek, a lot of what's talked about tonight, like in a lot of these places, is actually quite progressive. And I'd love to know, outside of this kind of echo chambers and places where we often are in agreement, what's your advice for people who are quite early on in that journey? Because some of these sort of these topics, and they're quite challenging for people. And until they cede power or responsibility to the next generation, and they're still in those positions, unfortunately, we live in a country where the media response is extremely negative often to philanthropy, and if you give your wealth to your kids or you buy a yacht, there's not much reaction. If you give a donation, you get it wrong, there's a big one. Sometimes even if you give a donation, you get it right, there's a big one. So I'd love to know, where do you encourage people to start in a way that is gentle and that meets them where they're at?
Yeah, who is it that said to me that sometimes you can get hammered more for being a hypocrite than doing something that's outright bad and stuff? The only way that I look at it is that, so we always have a tagline that we handle things with care and with confidence, right? So people can give with care and with confidence. And part of that is trying to have the type of conversations that you can't have in any other place and any other space. And there isn't that many spaces for well, for many people in this sector, but for wealthy people to have those really open, frank conversations. So when we do our work, we spend a lot of that initial phase absorbing a lot of the issues, and some of the things that are on the surface are not necessarily what's the root of the issues. But to have those types of conversations, I think, are key. I think sometimes that might be with good philanthropy advisors, sometimes it might be with peer groups, sometimes it might be connections with communities. As long as there is a space to have that opening conversation, and there is a level of power that is even and not imbalanced, then that's often the best way. Because the thing is, at some point, whoever's trying to change will need to just do the work and do the work themselves. The other thing that I would say about this is that there is a kind of misconception that says that people that might be right-leaning are potentially going to be more hostile towards some of the more progressive things that we might be saying up here. And that's not necessarily the case, because some people that we have worked with and that I've met might not be able to do the work, but can acknowledge that they feel that some of the things that I'm talking about is wrong and will make the big bet on that basis. So sometimes you'll be surprised actually what emerges from those conversations and how people respond to things that they might not understand, but they want to do something about.
Grant and Lee, do you want to chip in on that? Any tips for the audience?
I think, although I think I'm becoming increasingly more kind of progressive in the way that I think, lots of people that I've worked with, and I work in my family foundation as well, and it's been a very big journey, I'm sure Grant may relate to, around working with family members, and what does it mean, especially when you're working with people in different generations, how you find middle ground in your strategies and kind of approaches. And a lot of the language maybe I'm using tonight I wouldn't necessarily use, and a lot of spaces that I'm in with certain people. But I think it's also making sure that the people with lived experience are able to be sharing that with people who need to know it. And that doesn't need to be through literally spending time with people. It could be through podcasts or documentaries or books as well. And with a lot of people, I would kind of figure out who, if someone I need to influence, who is someone that they respect, who is someone within their circles that they kind of really, really admire, and how can I kind of find someone who they would respect enough, who's not super, super progressive, but progressive enough to be able to edge them a little further on the dial. And I'm 6 years into it, and it's slow and steady wins the race, I think. Just picking battles as well with it, and just going really, really slowly, and trying out, seeing what approaches work and what don't.
I'll give the senior generation perspective. From my own personal experience, I think it's about letting go, really. I think millennials, those of us children of that age, wow, what a generation. So I don't think we need to second guess. I meant what they think and believe, how they think the world should be shaped. So as one who's very much from the senior generation, I say we can give them up, we can give values, we can talk about what our family values are, but when it comes to the philanthropy, I think step back. They're the future.
And I just wanted to say one thing. So a lot of this is about progress over perfection. So often people are trying to get to this point of complete 100% understanding, and it might never happen because it's just a lifelong journey. So it's about moving forward as opposed to just looking for that kind of ultimate aha moment to get there for a lot of people, and really acknowledging that.
Yes, please.
Pass it on. I spend a lot of time working with US philanthropies, advising them in my focus area of education. And I'm constantly struck by the differences between the US and the UK and Europe in this respect. I mean, particularly around, to pick up on some of the things that you've been discussing, particularly around the appetite for system change, for transformation rather than reform, and the appetite for using kind of the whole spectrum of financial instruments that you can use, not just pure grant giving, but catalytic capital, concessionary loans. And I'm interested in why it's so different, and what do you think we can and can't learn from our American cousins?
So I agree. So some of the conversations that I will have with philanthropists in the US and other advisors, the language that they use, I don't think anything that I'm saying is particularly radical or anything, but the dial has kind of shifted a lot more in the US. I don't know what it is. There is more of a culture of giving in the States. There is more of an open conversation around a lot of these issues, be it racial injustice or other issues that people are willing to have. I think there is more of a, how can I put it? I don't know, in philanthropy, social sector spaces, like tough conversations. And over here, people are not really willing to have tough adult conversations where we don't want to offend each other over here. We kind of want to pitter and patter around things and not really get into it through fear of offending. And so I think there is there is a culture of giving that is just generally different. People will want to give. But there is definitely also an issue of us not really being able to sit down and disagree, and it's fine that we disagree, and have that type of conversation. Too many times, as someone said it in the audience, there's a lot of echo chamber conversations that go on and people stay in their silos, as opposed to people from different political or ideological perspectives getting together and actually really understanding where they can work together to change.
I agree with Derek, and I think there's maybe another aspect, and it's the nature of the charity sector itself here. I think the idea that many charities, many organizations kind of have maybe what you might term a siloed view of the world, and yes, they may have a very effective theory of change, but they're really only touching on a small part of the wider issue, the system, if you like, the system change issues. So I think there's the tools in North America, collective impact's one of them. We work with that and Thrive at 5 in early years. And so using those sort of tools, I think, which are maybe not so common here, I think, is a way to start to break down those silos and create more join up in the charity sector. So it's a debate we're having here, and I think there's movement, but slow maybe.
Yeah, I think there's a lot more language and progression within activism in the US than there is in the UK. And I think there are threads specifically within racial justice movements. I think the fact that a lot of the slave trade didn't happen on British soil, I think there's a culture around not seeing and a lack of accountability in the UK that I think the texture of that has been very different in the US, and I think there's a different layer of accountability to power in the US that lots of activist groups and communities have had a lot more experience to challenge, basically, than in the UK.
And, I don't mean to flip when I say this, but it's also cooler in the States to say that you're a philanthropist. And over here, I think the image of anything in the social sector is really problematic. The image of how we're perceived outside of this world when we're talking to either journalists or we're talking to anyone outside of the social sector about philanthropy is really, it's quite problematic in terms of the image of what this sector can do and what it can achieve.
And just building on that very briefly, but I think it's also about this notion of professionalism that you were talking about. I mean, I sometimes unfairly characterize some experiences I've had in the UK charity sector as instant coffee and bad biscuits. Nobody wants to actually spend the money.
Hello?
So Derek mentioned earlier the amount of money that's pouring into like the right-wing kind of ecosystem in the US, like think tanks, media. And I think in the US, there's started to be a counterbalancing investment on the left, on progressive side of politics, on the same kind of infrastructure, albeit more democratic, more justice focused. that money on the right is now pouring into the UK, and has been for the last decade, if not longer. And you see it in the IEA, and Liz Truss's crazy budget, etc. Philanthropy in the UK on the left is not investing in that political infrastructure. We do not have a tooled up think tank, media, campaigning infrastructure that's fighting and contesting national power. And so why is that? How do we solve that? And how do we both, yes, recognize the value of investing in like local systems change at a local level that's going to change local power, really important, but not do that at the expense of investing in contesting that national power, because we think that the elite bit of that is distasteful.
There can sometimes be a blurred line, can't there, between philanthropy and political funding. What's the right way to approach that if your interest is not is not necessarily a particular political party or ideology, but if it's simply the long-term interest of the country and the people who live in it?
Okay, I'll jump in because early childhood. I would say that it's absolutely vital, if we're going to get the long-term systems change in society, that we need to, when it comes to childhood, we need to value childhood very highly. Because ultimately, the biggest change that's going to happen in terms of influencing the next generation, in terms of are they ready for school, what's that pool of human beings going to be like in the next generation, will actually, in the end of the day, will fall on the policymakers to take decisions around the resources that they're going to deploy. Because ultimately poverty, which is one of the underlying causes of the bad outcomes we get in early years or early childhood, comes from it's from income, and it's from factors that are economic, and they're out with of the control of philanthropy. So you've got to actually be addressing the issues around advocacy. So I wholeheartedly agree with you that, and this is not party political, it's actually having a national conversation about the importance of childhood.
I was just going to say, I think part of it is lack of focus. So if you look at philanthropy traditionally over here, and it being the more liberal side, it's kind of funding here, there, and everywhere because it's trying its best not to be political. And this is political. Ultimately, if you have a board of trustees from a particular demographic and they're getting to decide who's worthy of their money, then that's a political decision. So I think part of that is, if you are going to really invest from the left-hand side, what is it going to be? Is it going to be decolonization? Is it going to be the abolitionist imagination? Is it going to be reparations? Is it going to be community wealth building? We're going to put X amount of millions of pounds because we want communities to determine their realities, birth their new realities, as June Jordan would say. Are we going to put our money into that and into a practice of philanthropy where it's more cultural than it is institutional, where risk and reward is shared, and give that to communities? Are we going to do that? I think if you had a collection of people that ideologically believed in that, then you would have a more focused way of giving over 20, 30, 40, 50, however many years, that could have a substantial impact on our democracy, on our curriculum, and all of the things that we care passionately about. But that inability to actually say, what is it that we're going to go for, I think is the thing that often ruptures that focus in terms of the kind of left-wing thinking towards philanthropy.
I think a lot of people are scared off as well, because within the charity commissioner, they don't want charities to be political. And it's like this weird elephant in the room that everyone's trying to dodge and work. And I think that within itself puts off a lot of funders and philanthropists in funding politically who are liberal, because it's just not part of their radar and they're not being encouraged to do it. But I think people should be held accountable, and I think keep talking about it and keep raising it to more liberal funders. And I hope, just like tax justice and impact investment, hopefully at some point there'll be that aha moment, like there has been for people on the right, to be like, it makes total sense. You have to fund politics. Like, the personal is political. We're already involved in it, just not overtly. So yeah, I think it's key.
And I do think that the reality at this point, for me, it feels like either there's going to need to be another crisis for something to really drastically change, or we will have, a Mackenzie Scott moment over here where someone just blows it out of the water and decides, do you know what, we're going to give X amount of millions of pounds to a particular issue that people consider radical. Because at the moment it's difficult to really see and plot where the steps are to achieving that level of change and cohesion. So it probably is going to be that one-off thing that's just going to change the culture in that particular way.
Mackenzie Scott's precedent is interesting, isn't it? Because she's obviously giving away a huge amount of money very quickly. And she deserves the praise she gets. And yet at the same time, you sort of think, well, should it be that praiseworthy? Because isn't it obvious that if you have that amount of money, if you can save that many lives, then you must. And I suppose it ties in with the ideas that you talked about in your book to do with the reparative nature of this, that you have an obligation. It's not simply a matter of being a nice person. If you have such serious amounts of money, then it's incumbent on you.
Sorry, Simon, I just want to pick up on that. What we saw in COVID was a number of funders break their own rules and be able to fund very differently, do more long-term funding, do more unrestricted funding, do some of this, loads of stuff that for years they'd said that they couldn't do. And I'm not looking back and thinking, oh my God, that was a horror story in terms of what they've done. I think the issue is, it feels like they're pulling back on some of the things that they had started to really do that was really providing more support to groups on the ground to be able to, create the things that they want to do and not just be these operators that's filling in application forms all of the time and spending, what is it, Lily, 35% of their time filling out application forms and stuff. I think we saw a sample, a snippet of what could be. But as I said, the reason why I think it's more likely to be another crisis or a Mackenzie Scott moment is because I'm feeling that a lot of funders are just pulling back on that freedom that they were starting to have at that particular point.
We are officially out of time, but I'm going to be a bit naughty and just squeeze in one more intervention from the floor, please.
Okay, thank you so much. I kind of wanted to go back to something you said about the charitable sector is very siloed in its approach. And and I would agree with you, it's highly siloed, but it's been created that way. And one of the biggest hurdles, burdens, obstacles within the community of organizations that are trying to tackle some of these big systemic social issues is that they are pitted against each other. The whole process is designed. So a small organization really tackling something is trying to address that, and they have to spend so much of their meager resources, time and everything to try to fill that grant application, et cetera, knowing that some other organization, next door, down the road, or whatever, they're competing against. And I do think that there is an absolute, we need to reclaim the word philanthropy. As Derek said, it's the love of humanity. And if it's only about the elite, the very wealthy, the Mackenzie Scotts, and it's not something that is really built from the ground up from the community, America works because there's millions of giving circles, people spending $20, $100 building to give to the community. That's what needs to happen here to make that change. If we can reclaim the word philanthropy. And I really think, I hope, I joined the Conduit because I do believe it's a place that could achieve that. And I really hope that that is what this community can achieve.
I think that's a really brilliant note on which to conclude. Thank you so much. And thank you to all our wonderful panelists for being with us this evening. And thank you to all of you for being with us.